Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our online Bible study. Good to be with you all today. Hope you're having a good week. I'm excited to be back in the Gospel of Mark with you. We've been working our way through the Gospel, looking ahead to Easter. We'll be walking our way through it until then. But today we find ourselves in chapter 5, verse 21 through 43. So we're kind of picking up where we left off last week, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you want to grab a Bible, open one up on your device, Mark 5, 21 through 43. Mark 5, 21 through 43. That's where we're going to spend some time today. And as usual, I have some questions for you to think about. And the first one is, who has let you down? Is there someone, or maybe even something, that if you really stopped and thought about it, you have invested in, you've put time into, resources into it, hope, trust, right? A sense of emotional attachment into, maybe expecting something in return, or at least hoping for a little something back, and yet that person or that thing just totally failed to deliver. It didn't give you what you were hoping for. Can you think of anything like that? What have you invested in that hasn't lived up to its promises, or either explicit or implied promises? Think about that, and then maybe another similar question, at least in terms of our reading today, is who has pushed you away? And maybe it's the very same thing that you invested in, right? That you were looking for, reaching out, trying to grab a hold of, and yet that very same thing kind of had a way of pushing back. One example could be finances, right? You put all of your eggs into that basket, and yet it hasn't given you the joy, or maybe the security that you hope for. Maybe even in a sense, it pushed you away, right? You invested heavily in the stock market, and that stock market collapsed or crashed, in a sense, pushing you out. Or again, maybe it is a person, someone that you emotionally gave yourself over to, that ended up letting you down and pushing you away. Uh, could be a thing, could be a person, but just consider those questions for a little bit, because I think they'll be applicable to our reading for today. Last week, we read the story of the demon possessed man who was living out in the Decapolis and the Gerasenes in Gentile territory. But now we find ourselves back in the land of Israel, witnessing another miracle. And you might remember, if you joined us last time, that there's this series of miracles that really display Jesus' power. And this goes all the way back to chapter 4. Let me get this up on our screen for us. In chapter 4, we heard the story of Jesus calming the storm. And Jesus was showing his power over that place. Uh, Waters within the story of the Bible and in the ancient world were often seen as these chaotic, perhaps even demon-possessed places, right? They were dangerous and unpredictable, and Jesus shows his power over that. And then Jesus shows his power over the demon-possessed man. That's what we talked about last time, right? Power over spiritual enemies, over death in a sense, because this man is reborn from the tombs. And today we're going to see Jesus' power over death for sure. He raises a young dead girl, and then also a sick woman who, she's sick, but she's also living ritually unclean. So Jesus has power over impurity, sickness. And so again, a number of stories here that all speak to the power of Jesus. And this is another one in that series. Marcus put them all together to really highlight this, right? You one after another, boom, 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 right? Wow, look at the power of Jesus. So we have to finish our story today and just kind of stand back in awe about what Jesus can do. But let's jump right in. Actually, I should first say, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, that Mark has a way of sandwiching stories. The big fancy theological term for this is intercalation, where he'll have one story that gets interrupted by another, and then that first story kind of picks up, forming a sandwich. One story with another story stuck in the middle be one way to see it. And that's what we have today. Maybe the clearest example. Jesus is confronted by a man who wants Jesus to heal his young daughter. And Jesus is on the way there when he's interrupted. The story takes a pause, and this other story breaks in of a woman who's been bleeding. Jesus heals her. And then the first story picks up. He raises up the young girl who has passed away. So this is another one of those examples. And in these sandwiches, we see the stories are often related, and often the inner story helps explain the outer story. And I suppose vice versa as well. But that's what we have going on here. But let's jump in for today. Again, Mark 5:21 said, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. So again, Jesus had been in Gentile territory in the Decapolis. He's now back in Israel, and that means a large crowd is there. Jesus sometimes tries to avoid the crowds, but they continually find a way to find him. And while the crowd in the Gentile land had pushed Jesus away, right? Remember, he heals the demon possessed man, casts the demons into the pigs, and then the people don't want anything to do with him. Here back in Israel, crowd has followed him again, and there he is, gathered by the lake. It says, then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, my little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. A couple things here. First, we learn that the man who comes to Jesus is a synagogue ruler. So often within the Gospels, uh, the religious leaders get a bad rap, right? Jesus has some harsh words for Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes. But I think the story is a helpful reminder in a couple ways. First, not all religious leaders were bad, right? We kind of clump them all together. We assume all Pharisees were bad. I think I touched on this last time. All Sadducees were bad. All scribes were bad, and that's just was not the case. In fact, if you told someone today, a Jew today, that they were acting like a Pharisee, they would probably say thank you. Pharisees probably made good neighbors. They were devoted, they were pious, they were faithful people. And so Jesus isn't attacking all of them. He's just attacking the ones who had gone off on the wrong track, right? Who weren't seeing things as they were meant to be seen or hearing things as they were meant to be heard. So again, not all religious leaders were bad. And there is a greater problem here, and that oftentimes we clump all of these religious leaders, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, synagogue rulers, maybe in the case today, into one bucket. They're all bad. And then sadly, what tends to happen in academics, but also in the church, is that we kind of apply that then to all of the Jews at Jesus' time, right? Like they were all of these uh, hypocritical works righteousness people walking around who were trying to earn their salvation and didn't know about God's love or grace, and were just so obsessed with rules and laws and purity and things like that. And that certainly wasn't the case. If you were a Jew in Jesus' day, and at least if you had read your Bible, right, you knew God's grace, you knew His love, you knew you were part of the family by a promise, the one made to Abraham, not by a law. And so today's passage, I think, is just a helpful reminder as we see this synagogue ruler who's caring and kind, who loves his little girl, right? He's like a dad, like so many parents out there, maybe some of you watching today, who just wants desperately for his child to be healed. We don't know too much about the synagogue rulers in Jesus' day. Uh, we don't know what their qualifications were or exactly what they did. Most likely, this was a person, Jairus. He had some monetary means. He was well to do, maybe had funded the synagogue and kind of oversaw its operations. Synagogues were different than the temple. Just want to point that out, right? The temple is where the sacrifices were made and the priests gather. Synagogues were more like community centers. You would gather there to talk and discuss. It was a meeting place in the community. They are also called houses of prayer. And so if you couldn't go to the temple because you were too far away or you just didn't have the time, these were synagogues where you would pray to God, gather together to hear His word, receive a teaching. Um, and so there were some men who were in charge of that, Jairus being one of them. And again, seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him earnestly. This is such a different reaction than the disciples. And we've talked about this before too in Mark. The disciples are kind of bumbling fools. They don't really get it. They're scared. They're confused. And we saw that when they were with Jesus in the boat in Mark chapter 4, right? A storm comes on the boat and they freak out. They think they're dying and don't understand why Jesus is sleeping. And yet here's this man who gets it. He sees in a sense who Jesus is, and he falls down at his feet. This kind of, I think, is meant to draw us back to the previous chapter, Mark 4, where Jesus was giving the parable of the sower. Maybe you remember that. And he says in verse 12 why he speaks in parables. And he says he speaks this way so that some people may be ever seeing but never perceiving, never hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Jesus wants people to see him for who he truly is, to have eyes to see. He wants people to hear about him and understand who he truly is. He wants people to have ears to hear. And so often that's not the disciples in Mark's gospel, but it is the synagogue ruler here. Here's an example, as will the woman who we're about to meet. These are examples of people who have ears to hear and eyes to see. Right? These are living examples that Mark gives us, in case you're wondering what that looks like. Um, so he asks Jesus to heal his little daughter. We have two stories today. Again, remember that sandwich? And they're both about daughters, as we'll see in a second. And what this man wants is for Jesus to touch her. So he wants Jesus to draw near to his daughter. He recognizes that where Jesus is, there is life and healing. Beautiful example of faith. And so Jesus sees this, hears the man's plea, and he says he's going to go. Jesus went with him. It says a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Now, this is interesting because this is a few chapters before. In chapter 3, verse 9, Jesus had tried to avoid the crowds who were pressing around him and actually escaped to a quiet place. But Jesus is also compassionate and kind. And so here he is being pressed in upon the crowds, and he has compassion. He doesn't avoid it. He kind of willingly enters into it. Okay, here's where the meat of the sandwich comes, right? So here's another story. It says a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. 12 in the Bible is a number of fullness and completeness. Think of the 12 tribes of Israel or the 12 apostles of Jesus. She's been bleeding for a long time. We don't know how old she is, but this is kind of a continual, nonstop bleeding. There's no hope in sight. She suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and spent all she had. Yeah, instead of getting better, she grew worse. So I asked you at the beginning to ask yourself that question: who has let you down? Well, for this woman, everyone's let her down. At least everyone she's invested in, right? She's spent all she had. Can you investing everything into something, all your eggs in one basket, and none of it is working out for her? Can you imagine her disappointment, her frustration, her anger, her fear, her sadness, right? Just wanting one thing more than anything else, and yet not finding it anywhere. It's a heartbreaking story until Jesus, of course, enters in. It says, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Okay, so here again, she recognizes, just like Jairus, that there's something about being in proximity to Jesus. Jairus wants Jesus to come and touch his daughter, lay his hands on her so she'll live, and this woman reaches out so she can touch Jesus, even just his cloak, because she thought in verse 28, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. What a beautiful beautiful example of faith. Faith reaches for and holds on to, clings to Jesus. Faith is a lot of things. It's a big word in the Bible. The Greek word pisteuo means a lot of different things. There's a fullness to the word, but one thing that it means to grab a hold of Jesus and to not let go, because you realize that in him you have healing and wholeness and salvation. And so she does that, and immediately, again, one of Mark's favorite words, things happen fast in Mark's gospel, and here we see it happening here, right? It's immediate. Her bleeding stopped. What had been going on continuously for maybe a majority of her life has just come to an end. What no doctor could do, Jesus does. And she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Something interesting about this story is all of these kind of feeling words, right? They're touching Jesus, they're pressing on him. She felt it in her body. They're touching his cloak. Lots of feeling words. You can kind of put yourself in the situation. I think we did this a few weeks ago. I think it's a good spiritual practice to just to try to imagine yourself as one of the characters in the story. And this story sure makes it easy to do. Because at once Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned around and asked, who touched my clothes? This is a strange part of the story, right? Because we know Jesus is God. He knows everything. How can he not know who touched him? right? And yet here I think we're presented with the humanity of Jesus. Jesus is fully divine. He is God, 100%, but he's also 100% human. And here we're seeing that human side. And so he recognizes something is off, but he doesn't know how it happened, where it came from. Verse 31, you see the people crowding around you. His disciples answered, and yet you asked, who touched me? Jesus, what's going on here? They're just as confused as we are reading the story. It's like, how can you not figure this out, Jesus? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. So he still doesn't understand, right? He doesn't know who it was. This is Jesus and his humanity. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear. It seems like when you experience the power of Jesus, uh, you end up in fear of him. And we've talked about that too. Fear of Jesus uh, is different than fearing other things, because when you fear Jesus, you have nothing else to fear. But here's this woman trembling with fear, telling him the whole truth, right? Just when you encounter the divine, you know it's not worth making anything up, right? You just let it all out. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Now, many people have questions about this passage because they think to themselves, if all I need is faith and then I'll be healed, uh, then then how come I'm not healed from my thing, or how come my loved one isn't healed from their disease? Well, the word healed here, I'm pulling it up, is sozo in Greek. It's actually the word for to save. So healed. This is the NIV. I don't know what your translation says. Not actually the best translation. Jesus is speaking to this woman about more than just the physical healing, more than just the stopping that blood, right? He said, your faith has saved you. Right? He's speaking to a greater wholeness, a greater healing than just the physical. And that's what faith does, right? It saves us. And sometimes that's manifested in the physical realm. It will be for all of us in the life to come. We will all be healed and made whole when Jesus comes back and he raises the dead. But again, in this case, he's not just talking about the physical healing. I think he has something broader in mind. He says, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. There is freedom and peace to be found in Jesus. She had been trapped. Now, this woman had been trapped in a number of ways by physical pain, right? Anyone who's ever suffered physically knows that it can be very trapping. It can feel like you're in prison, right? When you're in pain, you can't do the things you're used to be doing. But because this woman was suffering from a blood discharge, she would have also been seen as ritually unclean, which means she could never go to the temple to make her sacrifices, right? She could have drawn near to the temple. In fact, she probably would have to receive help from people. But after a discharge of any sort of bodily fluid, whether there's blood or after intercourse for men, you were seen as impure. And in order to get back again, you had to wait 7 days and cleanse yourself. Well, she could never do that because she was always bleeding, right? That never stopped for her. And while the Bible never quite says specifically why bodily fluid discharges make you unclean, the thought seems to be that uh, when a symbol and sign of life exits your body, right? That there's something off about that, and you're unclean. Again, it's not bad to menstruate, or it's not bad to have intercourse, right? It's not saying these are sinful things, not by any means. Just if you're going to approach the holy divine God, you got to clean up. You got to kind of wash your hands before you come before Him. It was a sign that when you approach the temple and you make your sacrifices, that this is a place of life, and it's not like any other place. We're going to treat it differently. So this is not a sign that this woman was sinful or bad or wrong. It's just that she was unclean. And that's imprisoning too, right? Because she couldn't make the sacrifices. And so here's Jesus, who has come to give her peace and to free her in more ways than one. It says, while Jesus was still speaking, so now the story picks up where we left it off. We're coming back to the other side of the sandwich here. While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? All right, so now it looks like that first story is over. No hope. It's all over. But I love this. Ignoring what they said. Jesus doesn't care what they think. Jesus knows the truth. And so he talks to the synagogue ruler. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Again, Jesus draws near. He calls to faith. The word that that woman had, same word in Greek, pisteo, just believe, just have faith. That's what Jesus wants. If faith is clinging to Jesus, right, he wants us to draw near to him because he knows that where he is, there's life. Verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of Jesus, the brother of James. So Jesus has a clear inner circle that'll become evident as the story goes on. This inner circle will be present at the Transfiguration and the Garden of Gethsemane. And when they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion there with people crying and wailing loudly. Because that's what you did at funerals in a death in Jesus' day. Even for the death of a small family, a poor family, there would have been kind of assigned people in the community who would play the flute and wail, maybe a minimum of 3 people. For someone who was probably wealthy and influential in the community like Jairus, there would have been quite a lot of people fulfilling that duty of helping the family mourn. And Jesus goes in and he says to them, he goes in to someone that everyone else thinks is dead, right? And again, this would have been a sign of uncleanliness. If you touched death, you would have been unclean for 7 days. And yet Jesus doesn't seem too concerned about that either. Just like he touches the woman who's bleeding or lets her touch him. And even just touching a bleeding woman would have made Jesus unclean for 1 day, and he would have had to wash, but he doesn't seem too concerned about that either. Jesus isn't concerned about catching impurity. He's more concerned about sharing purity and cleanliness and goodness and life, right? And so he goes in and he says to the people, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. Laughed at him. That makes me think of the story of Abraham and Sarah, right? Who laughed when they got the message that they would have a child in their old age. This does not seem to be a laughing born out of faith, right? But of doubt. They don't believe Jesus, and so they laugh at his promises. But Jesus is about to show them something. So he puts them all out. Uh, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum. Now that's an Aramaic phrase. Now Jesus probably would have spoken Aramaic, as best as we can tell, as kind of his everyday language, although Hebrew was spoken to, and Greek. He was probably trilingual, at least. And we don't know why Mark, at this point, decides to give us this little Aramaic phrase and not others. Although maybe it's, again, just to kind of help us put ourselves into the story and imagine it a little bit. He even gives us the words that were used, in addition to all of these feeling details, touching feeling. Talitha kum means little girl, I say to you, get up. And it says immediately, again, that word, when he's touched, immediately things happen. When you draw near to Jesus, right, there's no waiting period. Life and wholeness come. And immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. That's an interesting detail. She was 12 years old, and the woman earlier had been bleeding for 12 years, both numbers of fullness and completion. It's also a little detail that kind of ties the two stories together, right? We're supposed to see them in relationship to each other. 12-year-old girl, a woman bleeding for 12 years. At this, they were completely astonished. I don't know about you. I would like to recover my sense of astonishment with Jesus. For anyone who's been a Christian for any length of time, right, it's easy to be dulled by some of these stories, take them for granted. You've heard it before, but I think Jesus wants us to be amazed, because it is amazing to be in the presence of Jesus, to even hear about what he's done. So I, for one, I'm working on reclaiming that joy and that surprise over Jesus. And he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is kind of a contrast to the demon-possessed man we just read about in this same chapter. Jesus tells the demon-possessed man, go home and tell everyone what you've done. And that might be because he's in Gentile territory and not at risk of facing the wrath of the Jewish leaders way out there. But now he's back home in Israel proper again. And so now I think he tells this family to be quiet because he's got more work to do. He doesn't want to put his work at risk or at jeopardy of ending too soon. And so he tells them to keep it quiet. Well, that's our story for today. Again, who has let you down? A lot of people let that woman down in our reading for today, but not Jesus. Right? When you draw near to Jesus, he has salvation for you, wholeness, healing, uh, not just of the body, but also of the soul. Jesus shows that he's more powerful than death, than sickness, than impurity today. I don't know who has let you down, but I think our story for today reminds us that Jesus, he never will. Who has pushed you away? A lot of people pushed uh, the bleeding woman away, right? They couldn't do anything with her, but Jesus, he doesn't push away. He draws in with his powerful, powerful love. Well, I hope you're blessed by our time today. Thanks for watching today. God bless you, and we will see you next time.